Thank you very much, Lisa, for that introduction. Tracy and I are very happy to be here today with all of you. We had a wonderful time in Edmonton in September, and so it's just a real pleasure to share this with you today. So what we're going to do today is, first of all, it is based, as Lisa said, on the September 18th presentations that Tracy and I made at Practical PIAAC. So what I'm going to do is give you a bit of an overview of the survey from a layperson's perspective. So I'm going to talk about what are why does PIAAC matter, and if so, how does it matter? And then Tracy is going to give you her perspective as a workplace practitioner with many, many years of experience. So what are workers and employers saying? Then she and I are going to try to have a bit of a conversation, if we can manage it without echoing or getting everybody's ears sore. A bit of a back and forth conversation, because we're both still really struggling about how we best present to talk about the opportunities and the takeaways with regards to PIAAC. And then we're going to leave time at the end for any of you to ask our questions, and we'll do our very best to try to answer those questions. So to start with, hopefully that slide changed. There we go. Thank you. Sorry with the technology.
This is Tracy. I'm sorry to cut in. You can change the slides yourself, bottom left, arrow down.
Yes. Okay. Thank you. So this presentation, as I said, is the condensed version, and about the OECD report. You have a picture of the report on the left-hand side, and I'll also be referencing the Canada report, which is some information pertaining to Canada, which was put together by Stats Social Development Canada. So what I'm going to do is try to guide you through the survey data, and to explain from my perspective why PIAAC matters and why I believe that the data is not enough. So I hope you come away from this today with what I believe is my key message, and that is that PIAAC is a necessary tool, but it's not sufficient. So let's start with some basics, and I'll try to pull you through this without complicating things too much. So first of all, the important part about PIAAC and the surveys that took place before PIAAC is that people are asked to answer questions using materials that would be found in everyday life. So this is an attempt to make it what they call an authentic experience. So the PIAAC results were released last year, October 2013, and these represent surveys that took place in 24 countries. Those surveys were between the ages of 16 and 65. So now you can imagine, with 24 different countries participating, how challenging it is to develop test items that make sense in each of those countries, but which are also able to be comparable across the various countries. So this wasn't an easy challenge. So it means that certain choices were made about what to measure and how to measure it. So this is an important point about these choices that they had to make. And I went too fast, sorry. So looking at the definitions, there are some differences from the previous surveys, and I'm sure all of you are familiar with the two IELTS surveys. Now you'll remember that in IELTS, double S, and even the first one, 1S, we distinguished between prose literacy and document literacy. So prose literacy being the reading, narrative, like, novels, while document literacy is the kind of literacy you practice at work. Scanning, searching for information, reading lists, things like that.
Hey,
so in
Brigid,
PIAAC,
we're having
yes?
Are you advancing the slide at your end?
Not at the moment.
What slide?
Yes, I am.
What slide are we supposed to be on?
I have definition-literacy.
Okay, that's not the slide most people are seeing, so we may have to let Lisa do it. Because people aren't changing with your slide automatically. I have no idea why. Lisa's using the comment thing. So leave it, everybody knows now we're on definition literacy. You go ahead, we'll figure it out on the chat, okay, what we're doing. Sorry to interrupt you, but.
Do you want me to keep changing or tell you to change it?
I think you could say change it, and then we'll see what happens. Lisa thinks she can do the master change.
Okay. Thank you. So basically, in PIAAC, they combined document literacy and regular literacy, what I consider to be prose literacy, into one measure called reading literacy. And I'm not really sure why they did this, and I have asked them, and it doesn't seem that anyone has come up with an explanation that I understand or that I've been able to contemplate. So I really think this is a challenge for those of you who have been working in the area of workplace literacy, is that one of the nice things about document literacy is that we were able to make a really strong case that reading for work was really something different than reading reading for academic or reading to learn. So I think this is probably a step backwards, and I would love to hear from the department as to why they did this and why they made the changes. Next slide, the numeracy one. Basically, numeracy definitions are very similar to the ones that you're all familiar with from IELTS. Next slide on reading components. So there were two new areas in PIAAC that we hadn't had previously. And the first one I want to talk about is called reading components. This measures the skills of those who fall below level 1. So with PIAAC, for the first time, instead of having some of those people falling off the radar screen for being at the very lowest level without us understanding why, PIAAC gave very specific reading text to this group of people to try to find out what parts of reading matter and which parts predict reading competencies. So we have a new measure here of below level 1. Now, I personally have a couple of concerns about some of the tools that they've used in this, and it's because some of them were developed based on how children learn to read. But I think the bottom line here, my takeaway, is that any effort to better understand those at the very lowest levels is a good thing. So currently, we don't know a lot about the Canadian sample, but we do know that 4% of Canadians did fall within below level 1. Now this is compared to 15% across all of the countries. So the OECD, which sponsors PIAAC, is coming out with a more detailed information on this in the future. And I think it's going to be really important to study this, especially for those of you who work with people with very, very low skills. And I'm really hoping, although I've not had it confirmed at all, I am really hoping that the federal government will issue a report on the Canadian reading skills components. Now, I see we're not anywhere near in the same place in terms of the slides. So there's numerous. I'm going to switch them forward myself because the next slide is the second new area that we have in PIAAC, and that's called problem solving in technology-rich environments. So this was the OECD's effort or attempt to go beyond the notion of computer literacy, to have people work on two skills simultaneously. So we have problem solving, but using digital technology to do that problem solving. So the major change from IELTS was that PIAAC had people giving the answers on computers. So previously we had a paper and pencil exercise. Now, if you didn't feel comfortable using a computer, you could opt out and go back to using paper and pencil. So in Canada, something like 81% of the participants used a computer, which is pretty high considering that internationally the number was 74%. The one particularly challenging problem was not necessarily the use of the computer. Of course, that limits the information that we get about people's problem-solving skills if they don't use problem solve on a computer, but also that some of the tasks were pretty what I consider to be office-like. Filing and things of that nature. And so we found that a lot of young people didn't do well, but I think it didn't do the kind of technology that they use. Moving on to the next challenge, which is how do we find out more about certain populations? The federal government basically paid for the main part of the survey, but provinces were invited to do what they call an oversample. So what this means is that you can get more people sampled in your jurisdiction, and that gives you greater information. If you don't have enough numbers, they won't release the data. So for instance, this table shows you that many of the provinces, BC, Manitoba, Ontario, Saskatchewan, NWT, Nunavut, and Yukon, all oversampled for Aboriginal people. And we had oversamples for immigrants in 3 provinces and official language minorities. All of the Aboriginal data, which I'm going to talk about shortly, excludes those living on reserves. That's the way that StatsCan works, and we can talk about that later. And I would also, though, note that Alberta chose not to oversample, which I personally think is a pretty unfortunate situation given your high Aboriginal population. So whatever we know about Aboriginal people nationally is going to be what you'll have to work with in terms of numbers in your province. Moving ahead to the literacy scores themselves, as you can see, Alberta has pretty strong literacy scores. Now these are average ones, this first slide. And we have 7 provinces, as you can see, Manitoba, Nova Scotia, BC, Ontario, Yukon, PEI, and Alberta, which have higher than average scores. If we take a look at the 5 levels, across all of the provinces, you will see that great variations in the scores and real challenges being faced in Nunavut. One thing I would mention is that the provincial averages are based on where somebody lived in order to take the test, and it was not a question of maybe where they were educated, and I think that's something really important to pay attention to. Where people were educated and where they ended up working is it can be a whole other story. Another exciting aspect in the next slide is the whole question of social and economic outcomes. And what, as I said earlier, I mean, we've often had a conversation in Canada about IELTS being about economics, literacy being about an economic value to our economy. In PIAAC it was different. It asked people about voting habits, about voluntarism, about their connection to the community. The Canadian report unfortunately didn't look at these aspects in detail due to their time restraints, but the OECD report does provide some interesting information. And you'll see in this slide that there's a strong relationship between literacy patterns and social and political engagement. Our democratic processes rely on people having information processing skills so they can participate. Trust is another important aspect which they measure. Where there is a high degree of trust, people are willing to take more risks and feel more connected to their communities. And I really think this is an area that we have to pay more attention to in Canada. The next slide. Unfortunately, we can't make a direct comparison between 2003 and 2012. That's IELTS and PIAAC. We can't do this ourselves, but apparently StatsCan was able to do some hocus pocus with their numbers and come up with a comparison. But what I mean is that we don't have any way to sort of validate how this all works. But as you can see from this slide and the next slide, looking at literacy and numeracy, Canada has done worse or fared worse overall than in 2003. And then the next slide, if we start to look at the actual levels, you can see that, again, there has been some increase in the numbers at the lowest level, and on both the numeracy and the literacy scores. So those are the next couple of slides. I don't know why. I mean, I suppose it's anybody's guess. Maybe lack of dedicated and intensive resources. We've got 13 jurisdictions doing their own thing. People who go into workplaces who aren't asked to use their skills, the skills that they developed during their initial schooling. The Canadian report suggests shifts in the composition of the population in terms of maybe immigrants and birth rates. So that's another way to ask the question. So who are the Canadians at the lowest level? This chart shows us who generally are at the lowest levels. People who are older people, 45 to 65, less than high school education, obviously. People not in the labor force, people in service jobs, immigrants, off-reserve, Aboriginal people. So some of you who have been around a while probably noticed I've not mentioned the level 3. The discourse in Canada has been that level 3 is sort of the gold standard. We've all gone around saying that everybody needs to be level 3. And it turns out that this was really a Canadian position and one that was not strongly supported by the OECD, and which effectively abandoned it a few years ago. So yeah, a lot of higher level jobs do require level 3, but the OECD felt there was no evidence that across the board everybody should be level 3. So I think this is a real shift in how we look at it. So why does this matter? First of all, it matters because a reputable organization did the survey. They had 24 different countries. The science behind it is very solid. And you can see here that the proportion at the highest proficiency levels, I mean, Canada is pretty good, pretty middle of the pack, but we haven't moved very much. The second point I want to make is that one of the things that PIAAC does is gives us an understanding of what perhaps we could be doing better. And we could look at those countries that are doing much better. The third point is the skills of young adults, and that's something that OECD really played out here. And this chart might be a little hard to read, but basically what they're looking at is what are the skills of young people versus what are the skills of people who are leaving the labor market. And because we know that people's skills decrease with age, you basically need to have a group coming into the labor market with strong enough skills that when they lose those skills over time, their skills are actually higher than the people who are leaving, who they're replacing. In our country, we're not doing as well as we could be. Some countries like Korea are doing very, very well. Their skills of their young people are incredibly higher than the people leaving the labor market. Places like England are going to have some challenges because actually the young people have skill levels in PIAAC less than the people leaving. The fourth thing I think is really important is the fact, the information we've got about Aboriginal people. And this next chart shows us that basically education and strong skills matter. When you look at the Aboriginal data, you see that those with stronger literacy skills have other characteristics comparable to the general Canadian population. So I think this is powerful information that can help guide discussions about the future of Aboriginal education and about the need to continue to find culturally appropriate and meaningful ways of improving literacy skills among Aboriginal people. It's been about a year since PIAAC was released. It's been over a year now. And there are a few thematic reports coming out, and this is the latest list that I got from Employment and Social Development Canada. These are going to be sort of monographs looking in depth at particular issues. I would say, unfortunately, there's been virtually no press coverage in Canada on PIAAC, even at the time of the release. Minister Kenney virtually said nothing. There was no posting on the website about PIAAC. So I would hate to see a lot of money spent on this and then have it complete inattention here in Canada. So my bottom line on this is that PIAAC is absolutely necessary to better understand literacy skills. It's absolutely necessary to convince governments on why they should spend money on education, adult ed, and it's absolutely necessary to build the case, but it's not sufficient. Having this international information has both helped and hindered the development of policy and practice in this country. In my opinion, we've had an over-reliance on IELTS to the exclusion of other measures that could give meaning to literacy practice. And we live in an age of accountability, of performance measure, the adage that whatever can be measured matters. And PIAAC and its predecessor surveys have defined what matters for literacy practice in this country. I've struggled with trying to find a balance between the quantitative data from PIAAC and these international surveys and my own gut instinct that the qualitative data, the stories from the field, matter as much as quantitative data. No one's going to argue that good literacy skills are important. But always remember that in PIAAC, these are constructs that the test developers created to measure their understanding of skills. It doesn't mean it's not right. It just means that it's a test and that there are other ways of understanding and observing and demonstrating these skills in the classroom and in real life. There was a fellow I met last summer, David Mallos from the UK, and he said, PIAAC does not replace knowledge on the ground. Don't use it to design intervention, use it to raise issues and message for advocacy. So PIAAC is a good population measure of literacy skills. However, it was never intended to be a measure of individual skills. In this country, we seem to have an extraordinary emphasis on the 5 levels to the exclusion of alternate ways of measuring progress. Literacy discourse relies heavily on questions of levels, on how many hours it will take to move somebody from one level to another. As I said earlier, this is a very Canadian phenomenon. In many of the European countries, one source of data that is used at the macro level to design policy interventions. In other countries, there is a variety of different mechanisms to look at the picture of individuals who have literacy challenges, as well as to guide the delivery of literacy practice. Over the last 10 years, we've seen a shift to have benchmarks that speak almost exclusively of literacy as workplace practice. Now, I would agree that work is where many of us spend most of our time, and that workplace practices can contribute or inhibit the development of literacy practice. But the political discourse in this country has placed literacy as only a workplace and economic issue. Literacy's role in social cohesion, societal stability is ignored. Other venues for literacy practice and growth, such as community and the family, appear undervalued. We've set up a dichotomy between literacy as a social good and literacy as an economic good. So here we have jurisdictions split between provincial and federal responsibilities. We have federal government leading the charge on the economic value of literacy, with the provinces focusing on literacy as sort of a form of adult or second chance education. Provinces are even dividing responsibility for literacy from responsibility from workplace training, which is often about essential skills. So it's a real hodgepodge of how we respond to this issue. IELTS was pretty easy to understand. We were able to say, almost like grade levels, we have these levels that we have to get people to. But we had a situation where people started to push back against that notion of levels that were developed, or some people just accepted the levels without question. And so in my opinion, I think we have to be really practical about this. This is why I'm really happy that we're not talking about levels anymore, but how do we talk about what people need? Just because you have strong skills doesn't mean you always use them. PIAAC doesn't talk about how we use skills in our daily life. It also gives individuals a sense of a simplicity that I don't think is really true. IELTS and the way we talk about a PIAAC in terms of levels, if we do that, makes it sound like some kind of mechanical process. What we need is not moving people from one level to another. We need quality programs that are accessible with sufficient funding, teacher training and resources. And we need learner supports, income replacement, childcare. Here in Canada, we seem to value youth education and formal education. And I believe that's why adult education sits at the margins. We've made adult education something about those people. In my ideal world, there would be a variety of ways of knowing, of measuring, and each would be valued. I still don't think we've got the message right about PIAAC. I know I don't. Many people in this country are invested in IELTS and in the levels. Certainly governments are. And not having level 3 is causing some challenges for places who have benchmarks now that state that level 3 is their guideline, their benchmark. Everyone must be level 3. I believe that we don't have the kind of leadership in this country to talk about how do we craft our messages. This is a particular problem for the literacy community now that we have a funding crisis with weakened national and provincial organizations. So I hope this gives you a sense of the PIAAC data and an overview. I hope you understand a little bit about why it's important. I hope you understand and that it's important to think critically about why it's not enough. It's an opportunity to start a dialogue that's not just about levels. There's a lot of information here that needs to be mined, shared, and debated. But we need alternatives and ways to express how people learn and progress in an authentic way. I'm not willing to throw the baby out with the bathwater, but I would say that a strong reliance, should I even say exclusive reliance on PIAAC is not healthy. So PIAAC is necessary but not sufficient. And I'd just like to end, before I turn it over to Tracy, with a quote from the PIAAC report. There is a strong case to be made for maintaining public investment in skills and in using them effectively. The results underline the need to move from a reliance on initial education towards fostering lifelong, skills-oriented learning. Governments can do a lot to design more rigorous standards, provide financial incentives, and create a safety net so that all people have access to high-quality education and training. Thanks. Over to you, Tracy.
Thank you, Brigid. That was great. So I'm going to try to change the slide on my own. I don't know if it didn't change to you. I am now on slide 25. So my plan is to give some perspective from a workplace educator point of view, which is what I've been for a long time, as you'll see in some of these slides. I'm going to talk a little bit about what people are saying about PIAAC in the field, employers, workers, other people. And I'm going to talk about how I intend to try to use PIAAC a little bit for planning and practice, and certainly when I talk to planners and practitioners. And then I'm going to talk about what this might mean to me and what it might mean to you. Oh, thanks for telling me you can hear me. Nice to see some familiar names there on the list. So that's the plan. I want to also begin by saying I don't disagree with absolutely anything Brigid said. In fact, I hope to go through a similar ground from a different point of view. So, next slide is 26. Here is how I see PIAAC. In the overview YouTube video on PIAAC from the OECD, which some of you may have seen, it was sent out for part of the conference, and maybe it was sent out as part of the preview for this webinar. The narrator, the video is called Boost Skills for Jobs and Well-Being, in case you want to look it up. The narrator says, PIAAC, it's a skills map of the world. And I think that's a really great description of PIAAC. It's a view of the world that is just amazing. From way up at that 30,000 feet level, you can see patterns and features of the world that you can't really see from the ground. You can see the world in all those PIAAC charts and graphs. I like to think of it, you can see a lot up there from 10,000 meters, which is what I should have said instead of 30,000 feet in Canada. But you can't see your mom. You can't see workers in your community. You can't, maybe you won't even be able to see your local community. We can see Canada, and we can probably see a snapshot of your province. I think that all of that data is totally amazing, and I think that when I really sit down and think about it, I know that I don't live in the sky. I don't live at 30,000 meters, 30,000 feet, or 10,000 meters. So the people who are doing that, those are often planners, people who are really looking to the future. So I'm switching to the next slide. I see some of my jokes won't work if you don't switch with me. This is a photo that I took out the window of an airplane flying across the Arctic. Slide 27. It happens to be a photo of Greenland, but it could be a photo of Arctic Canada. Next slide. From 10,000 meters up, look at all those flows. Look at the water. Look at the ice, the glaciers hitting into that amazing water. You can see all the features and bumps and rocks, and you can even see the curve of the Earth. This is a photo of the Rockies, slide 29, on my flight when I went to Alberta to the Practical PIAAC conference. There's a few scattered clouds there, but you can certainly still see the mountains. So this macro view, as Brigid described it, I like to think of it with this image of views of the world from a little bit high up. Not easy to get to where I do most of my work, which is here in slide 30, down on the ground. Most of the time, the kind of help I need from data is help to see over a wall. I maybe need something a little bit more like a ladder. I need data, but I need data that is close to the ground and very, very much about the people from here, wherever here is for me. So there's a little bit of a disconnect for me from the big picture PIAAC data, which is perfect for speaking to planners and looking to the future and looking at our whole country or your province perhaps, but is really hard for me to translate into my practice. So let's move to the next slide, 31. This is me. This is a photo of me to prove that I've been at this really a long time. This is a newspaper photo from August 1990 about a program I did with my late and very much missed colleague Ruth Farrell, who's there looking as young as anything on the right. This was a workplace skills program, soon to be called Basic Skills. We taught in this program listening, speaking, cross-cultural communication, writing, reading, math for statistical process control. Of those things, only reading and math are included in what PIAAC measures, mostly because those other things are really difficult to measure reliably across many, many languages around the world. Ruth and I, we taught what was needed in that workplace by our understanding of what was going on. All of these skills were small e essential, they were foundational, and yes, they were even renewable skills because some of the people, you know, had learned things before but weren't applying them at work. So as I would have said about IELTS, I say about PIAAC, don't let that PIAAC lens be the only lens that you see the world through. Okay, let's skip forward to today with slide 32. This is a 2014 picture of me, not a very flattering picture of me actually, that was also in the Vancouver Sun. This is a picture from one of my current gigs, the Kaizen Club, where I go every second Wednesday if I'm in town. We have evolved in that very same workplace, by the way, to a kind of embedded learning strategy. I still go and I co-teach this with the continuous manager. And the group of people who comes to this group is learning continuous improvement methodology, also known as lean production, and they are learning it together. The book I'm holding is a standard basic text for some of the background knowledge in lean. It's required reading for a certification program commonly that engineers, supervisors, and managers do. In our group, frontline workers work our way through that together as we look at real-life problems. We read the book together, we write summaries and presentations together, we learn from DVDs and guest speakers, and we go on tours of other companies. But mostly, we work on real, practical problems, and we apply principles of problem solving and the methods of continuous improvement to what's going on in their workplace. As you know, those of you who are practitioners, problem-based learning is high in integration, in retention, and certainly in motivating people. So some of those PIAAC assessed measures are in fact here in this program, but just like my example from 1990, we're outside of the PIAAC measured skills and more than we are in, because we're trying to stay really close to real lived work and learning, and we're not so concerned about trying to get a pre and post measure across a big population. The next photo is slide is a photo of that current group, learning continuous improvement together in the group we call Kaizen Club. So there you go. I always think it's nice to see the people. So the next slide is a picture of Parliament, because I'm going to tell you a story from a conference I went to in Ottawa. Last June, I attended a conference that was a skills conference, a national skills conference. And one of the sessions I went to, there was a university-based academic presenting his findings from digging down into the PIAAC data for Canada. He was interested in the skills data for a particular group of people. He was looking at people who had taken the PIAAC assessment, people who had self-identified as a journeyman tradesman, or maybe you say tradesperson, and people who had chosen to report their wages. So think of that Venn diagram. all the people in Canada, and then the subset who took the PIAAC assessment, so he has their results, and then among those people, the much smaller subset who were journeyman tradesmen, and then I don't know how many of them chose to report their wages, but he needed all those data. Because the researchers' questions around PIAAC assessed skills for this very small group of a few hundred Canadians was, what was the correlation between their skills and their wages? I watched the presentation and I listened for the ways the researcher presented the PIAAC data and all of the assumptions in the PIAAC data. And as he went through the findings, he said these words that made my hand just shoot up in the air before I even realized I had raised it. He said, the words that are there at the bottom of the slide, literacy doesn't matter. Wait, what? I thought. I was witnessing the birth of a soundbite, and I was worried that I would have to live with it for many years. So careful explanation. Of these self-identified journeyman tradespeople, who of course are some of the best educated trained workers we have, and certainly blue-collar workers, and workers who don't lose it, by the way, because a tradesperson tends to use their skills every day, of those PIAAC respondents, it seemed that their numeracy score was higher correlated with their relative wages than their reading scores on PIAAC. Now this is quite different from suggesting that reading doesn't matter or that literacy doesn't matter. What this is saying, in fact, is that numeracy really matters in the trades, which the speaker quickly conceded to me. I hoped this happened before anybody in the room had tweeted the other observation. And then, in the next point, the researcher went on to present the findings for Aboriginal Canadian journey tradespeople who had taken the PIAAC in Canada. And for this admittedly very much smaller group, he said again, literacy mattered even less for Aboriginal tradespeople. My hand went up again, and we worked back from that broad and, let's face it, pretty misleading generalization to the idea that the data said math scores were correlated with wages in an even more pronounced way for Aboriginal respondents to PIAAC. Well, what does that mean? On the surface, it makes sense that the trades, and we don't know which ones, require math and that some trades pay higher wages. Wages vary quite a bit among trade specialties and certainly across regions in Canada. All of that makes sense. So I want you to remember this story. Don't extrapolate or make a conclusion from the PIAAC data that goes beyond the story that the data can tell us. If you hear somebody do that, or if somebody says something that makes no sense, like literacy doesn't matter, please put up your hand and ask a question that walks back through the facts. Soundbites have a life of their own, and in this case, I think with our previous aisles, we did, as Brigid said, we let the simple story get a little ahead of the facts. In this case, with PIAAC, I think it really matters that we get it right this time. So I hope you remember that story. And by the way, literacy does matter. So my next slide, please. My message basically from that is you have to know enough about PIAAC to ask good questions. Next slide. Let's look a little closer to the ground. This is a photo of Vancouver, where I live, as we made the approach to land. We're about 1,000 feet up. So what at the 1,000 feet level, where you can see maybe your whole town or a sector in your town, what are people saying about PIAAC? Oh, that didn't work. Oh, maybe it'll work for you. Owners and managers. I am worried about PIAAC findings for Alberta. Said no owner or manager ever, right? I don't know if the animation worked for you there. The next slide. You know what employers are worried about? Employers are worried about the world market. In fact, they're worried about the falling Canadian dollar. Next slide. Owners and managers of businesses, they worry about stuff like cash flow, competition, what are their suppliers doing? Next slide. And they are really always interested and worried about wasting money. Next slide. If the owner of a business in your neighborhood has ever even heard of PIAAC, because Brigid said this, the media has been super silent, as has most of the governments in Canada, or maybe all of them, certainly from the feds to my province. If they've heard of PIAAC, they may have read about it online, or they may have seen it in a newspaper. This is the only article of anything other than a press release that I could find in the business section of a Canadian newspaper. And you'll see the headline they chose was "Large Digital Skills Divide Among Canadian Adults." So that's the problem solving in a technology-rich environment data. And if we go to the next slide, they may have heard this on the radio. Jeff Johnson, Alberta's education minister, was the chair of the Council of Ministers. So last October, when PIAAC was released, he gave us a quote, a nice soundbite, where he said, "PIAAC tells us we've got some work to do, particularly in the areas of numeracy, and we always want to do better in literacy as well, but we're competitive." So there we are, solidly in the middle, and I am pretty sure if I was a business owner, I would think, yeah, okay, we're competitive, we're doing okay. And they might have thought, as employers so often do, well, you know what, I don't actually hire those people with low skills, so I'm not worried about that. Let's look at what employers are actually saying about PIAAC. And the answer is almost nothing. Employers are saying nothing about PIAAC. And before I leave the topic of employers, I want to say that I always find it's a really great idea to treat everybody as a learner. You know, I'm a learner, a business owner is a learner, and those people are learning all the time and often under really great pressure. And very often in Canada, in a small business, the employer owners, business owners, don't have a skills profile that is very different from their employees. They may have had the opportunity to learn more things, but and they have very meaningful learning opportunities inside their business. So if you are a teacher, if you're a practitioner, teach them. There's many teachable moments in even casual meetings with employers. Listen to what they say and help them understand that there are things they could do for themselves and for their employees. Because one way or another, next slide, work goes on. You know, whether it's a heavy industry or a high-tech industry, employers often don't have very much time to figure out what balls are in the air and what balls aren't. I often say about my own clients that they're all from pretty well-run businesses and really smart guys, or they would have never found me. So next slide. What are workers saying about PIAAC? Well, not much, okay? Almost nothing. Let's look at the next slide. This should be the lady at the computer. That data on problem solving in a technology-rich environment, it seems to be in tune with how people are working now. Almost all the workers you meet these days have some interface with technology, whether it's on a machine, a kind of, I met a guy the other day who carried a laptop, or had a laptop actually mounted on a forklift because all the data from his warehouse came that way to him. I think workers know that they are working and certainly problem solving in technology-rich environments, but they probably aren't talking about it much because for workers too, work goes on. Things are going fast. So work, I'm on slide 48. Work is very close to the ground. I couldn't resist carrying from the airplane. This is the view out of a bus window, and certainly looks like Alberta to me, but I don't know for sure. So this is the view out of a bus window. We're getting pretty close to the ground now. What about planning? Brigid mentioned it. Governments, people who are planning, they are the people who are interested, mostly interested in PIAAC, and maybe haven't even themselves taken the time and made the effort to learn about PIAAC, right? So if you think about government departments at every level, even city departments, people who have planning systems people, systems analyst people, anybody who wants to understand this snapshot, because PIAAC it's a big snapshot, it's a panorama really, but it is a snapshot of skills. Anybody who who thinks and believes that having a course for better skills in Canada is something that they need to be worried about, or, you know, I love the OECD, their two messages, right? Well-being and economic benefit. So anybody who is interested in the well-being of Canadians may want to have a good look at the PIAAC data too. Next slide. Planning is about finding those roads that lead to the future that we want to reach, whatever those are. People who work in government and people who are planning the future are all using this kind of data, and you can help them understand and make good use of that data if you understand it too. What about our practice? That brings me to us. What about practice? So my big message to you, and I thank Brigid for helping us do this, is know the data a little bit and be informed. And if in your practice so far you haven't actually had a chance to pay much attention to what workers are doing with technology or what problems they have right in front of them, do that. Experiment with that a little bit. I think you'll find that is worthwhile. Because here on the ground, next slide, time is always short. And, next slide, the road always takes unexpected turns. If you're a practitioner on the ground, you are dealing with curves in the road probably every day. It's one of the fun things about workplace learning. And next slide, 54, if you are a workplace educator, your close to the ground is mostly about people, right? It's not about numbers, it's about people. So we go back to good practice. People hire me and they hire you to do our best work with people. So here's my PIAAC action plan on 55. Number 1, be informed and learn about PIAAC. It is daunting, but actually the OECD website has some pretty good ways you can explore the data and even generate, go into the data and generate your own graphs or find out specific things that you want to know that aren't in these reports or maybe weren't in Brigid's slides. My second thing is get into the discussion. If people are talking about literacy, numeracy, economic factors, social good, the future in your community, get out there and make sure that people don't leap to uninformed decisions or assumptions, or maybe even that they don't even know that we have this data to use, which wouldn't surprise me because people have been pretty quiet about it. The next thing I'm going to do for sure is ask questions. I am so glad that I was in that room in Ottawa to stop everybody tweeting that literacy doesn't matter, and that I was able and knew enough about the data to walk the guy back through the assumptions of PIAAC and say, wait a minute, you're talking about only the people who took the survey and only the ones who said they were journeymen and only the ones who told you their wages. So how many people is that? And of course we got a pretty low number. So I would say ask questions as much as you can, and of course be a good resource. Teach other people about PIAAC. That's great. So next slide, and Lisa was too far ahead there, that's funny. 56, am I going to change my practice? Well, my practice, this is actually the logo used by one of the programs that I work with, all our hands together, making something beautiful. I think my practice probably will change a little bit because PIAAC can show you where to set up your ladder. Like there's a lot of interesting data there around young people, around the aging workforce, and around different communities. So if I was looking for places to do new good, or looking for ways to engage people, there may be places there that tell you which ground is the place that you might want to be. Next slide now, 57. I use this slide a lot because in my practice, I am always trying to achieve balance. There's always multiple interests, multiple priorities in workplace learning. The needs of the learner, the needs of the workplace, the needs of the community, and yes, even our country. So especially if you have public funding, I think you got to balance these things out and don't get thrown off balance by a new piece of data, right? Integrate it and find balance. So let's dig a little bit deeper here. Will I adjust? Will I change my practice? That was 58, now 59. What I find is maintaining that balance is always a dance, right? And it can be a real challenge for those of us who are in practice. I see so many friends here on the line, so let's stay together in that discussion, and I hope in our question period we'll be able to talk about how you see this integrating into your work. Next slide is back to that shot of the Rocky Mountains. What can we see from up here, from what the PIAAC data tells us? What are you wondering about now, and what does all that information maybe change us to do? So if we look at slide number 61, Brigid and I are going to have a little conversation about the key messages from PIAAC for Canada, and what could we say when we talk about PIAAC that could be useful and helpful. So I'm going to turn my mic off and throw the conversation back to Brigid. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Tracy, for that lovely, lovely overview, and of course with your wonderful pictures. I think that you know, they say pictures are a thousand words, and I think that has been the case here for sure. You know, one of the things that I wanted to just raise, and Tracy, you know, you and I have tried to noodle our way through this. One of the things that happened after we spoke in Edmonton is some people came up to me and said, you know, I guess one of the messages I'm taking away is that, you know, PIAAC really isn't that important. And I thought to myself, well, no, that's not exactly the message I want to leave people. I want to somehow find a balance, as you said, that have people understand that PIAAC is that 10,000 meter look at the world, but it's not. It shouldn't be the only look at the world. And so that's what I mean about not wanting to throw the baby out with the bathwater. And I've been struggling over this. I've had many people say to me, now what do we do, Brigid? We used to say 42% of Canadians can't read well enough, and not 42% aren't at level 3, and it's going to take 40 hours of instruction to move these people from 2 to 3, and we've had all this kind of talk for the last 10 years. And now we're kind of telling people, don't talk like that. So if we don't want them to talk like that, what do we say? I mean, what are our key messages? We're good enough? We're kind of in the middle? What do you think, Trace? How do you think we should phrase this?
Well, I don't think PIAAC shows us that there isn't action that needs to be taken. You know, we're in the middle. Is that a crisis? Well, I was thinking about this morning. My kids' one of my kids had a high school principal who had been a PE teacher, and she was an incredibly motivating person. And she used to say, her name was Jill Pleshikoff, you can only coast in one direction. So I think part of the message has got to be, we are not gaining ground on the world, and in fact, the world is pulling away. When you look at the people at the top and the differences between, well, like that, the message, like you said, Korea across the board, right, at the top. So I think that. Now, in terms of the level 3, you maybe know, I never actually bought into that because I did not incorporate that greatly into my practice with people because it didn't make sense to me. I think things are so complicated that one number was just simply didn't make sense. You know, I guess I'm a bit more of a three-dimensional thinker. But certainly when we talk to, like, you know, bureaucrats, when people ask me to fill out forms, or if we were doing the kind of project where you had to assess, do something and assess, sure, we would do that. But I wouldn't make the test the point of the teaching. And I think that would be something to talk about. And maybe in the discussion period we can talk more with people who in fact have. So my thing was, and the reason why I showed the old yellow newspaper photo is I've been doing this literally since 1989, and I haven't done much else. So I feel like I have a giant toolbox, including what used to work before we ever had the assessments, you know. So I think maybe if you're new to the field and you look in your toolbox and everything you have has IELTS numbers on it, yeah, maybe we need to sort of say what else is there and how else can we do things. I'm going to put my mic off so you can say something, Brigid.
Not as smooth with the on and off of the microphone. Yeah, I think that the level 3 has been really problematic. My other concern is that we've just, with such an over-reliance on IELTS, you know, just to the exclusion of other ways of talking about this. I mean, I think that the governments have had a big role to play in this. But I think we've handed it over to them, like in the literacy community, by talking about IELTS and doing all of the, the promotion that we've done over the years. It gave policymakers something to hang their hat on. So now we're in a situation where we're going to try to change the conversation. And, so that's what I started thinking about. How would I change that conversation? Well, first of all, I think one of the things I would say is while we focus on the individual through PIAAC, let's not blame the individual. I look at some of the information I've heard about from European countries where there was after IELTS, there was a major focus and a major intensive campaign, for instance, to target everybody who was at level 1, give them 1 year of training with full, income support, the whole kit and caboodle. It's really difficult to have a situation where we're expecting individuals to make their own personal choices and we don't make it easy for them and we're blaming the victim. Many of us, we come home after a long day at work and we don't go to school. We don't do anything like that, and yet we expect people who have some of the least resources to somehow get their act together and do something. So I don't think that we've ever done anything here in this country that has made it easy for adults to return to learning. At the same time, I think that we've not done a lot in terms of organizing our businesses and our society in a way where it's easy to learn. And by that I mean encouraging employers to support training, building HR and training strategies into any sort of economic development plan. We're not very organized about this, and we somehow have this vision that it's all magically going to come together. So that's something that really annoys me about the conversation about IELTS and PIAAC, is that somehow this is all about individuals and that they just got their act together, Bob's your uncle. And I don't think it's quite that easy, but I'm not quite sure how to express it. Tracy, what do you think?
Well, we were talking for a while about, what can we say that will resonate with those policymakers, with the Canadian public, with employers, as you say, Brigid. Those are all the people we went out and tried to communicate about IELTS with. Now, given the twist of PIAAC, particularly, the changing the a kind of mentality around level 3, but also saying, everybody has a kind of wide range of skills and there's a place for everybody. I don't know. We haven't actually fallen on what will we say that will resonate. What message can we give that's accurate, that's helpful, and that maybe as a field, such as it is these days, we could all take up as a message from PIAAC. I hope we're going to blaze through here a bit, so we certainly have our time for questions. And I'm going to just go ahead while I've got the mic and move us on to the next slide. And the next slide goes to some of the things Brigid talked about too, the idea that PIAAC is, necessary but not sufficient. Was that it? Something like that. So basically, what does success mean? If success isn't going to be everybody being a solid level 3 or heaven help us, a level 4 or something, if success means that you are good at navigating technology, if it means that you can apply your reading to screens and paper and other things, if it means that you can pull up to kind of rise to a situation at work, at home, in the community, then we need to know as a field that there are additional and alternate ways to show and measure success. That seems to me to be a place where practitioners can have a big role and perhaps even educate people. I showed my 2 examples because all of those things the employer thought were really, really important and really useful for him and his company. I'm on 63 now, sorry. I don't know if you guys have figured that out. I moved slides. Success, additional and alternative ways to show and measure it. So I think that is a role for practitioners. I don't know, and if we have that message, if we can always show the alternatives, maybe, quit hiding what you actually do in your program and show the number data if that's what people want, but then show all those other things too. I think we can maybe create that little space in everybody's head to say, wow, there's more here than hard numbers. I mentioned that I'm interested in continuous improvement. I can tell you that when we measure the impact of a change at work, we don't just measure one thing. We probably measure 5 or 6 different things. So I'm going to leave that one and just I'm going to ask you to go to the next slide, which is, I think, the last slide of this section, which is takeaways about PIAAC and what mindful messages can we have. And I'm going to turn my mic off and let Brigid come back on, giving her lots of time to do that now, while we talk about what our takeaways are. And you can see that I personally feel that there's lots of takeaways here for practitioners, for government people, for all kinds of people. So Brigid, if you want to talk a little bit about the takeaways and go back to your wait, PIAAC does matter, I think that will take us to the question period. Okay.
Thanks, Tracy. Yeah, I think there are quite a few takeaways. I think that PIAAC is very rich in ways that IELTS wasn't. We have the economic arguments, which we're very well honed here in Canada, but there's this whole area about social capital, about trust, about voluntarism, about quality of life, about social cohesion. I'm very concerned that Canada hasn't focused on that. Those data were not contained in the Canadian report, and I've got no information that would indicate that there's going to be any kind of monograph on that. I think that's something we really do need to pay attention to. I know they're going to talk a little bit about social outcomes. I worry that that's going to stay in the area of health and not so much about, civic engagement. So that's a takeaway for me, is that literacy and numeracy and all these things matter in ways that are more than just economic. Another takeaway is that I think we can start to target certain populations, and we'll understand an awful lot more. And in particular, I think we've got way more information about Aboriginal people off reserve, and we've got way more information about people who are below level 1. And that's a whole different ball game in terms of instruction than dealing with other scenarios. I think the other takeaway for me is that PIAAC, as with IELTS, it's got to be a test. It's got to be authentic. It has to be as representative as possible of what adults need. And I think this continues in the tradition of saying to people, it's not about grade levels. It's not about a static measure like how much education you had in the past. It's about what you can do today. And I think that's really important because that really resonates. It resonates with employers. It resonates with workers. They want skills that they can use today, not skills that might have been important a while ago. So I think the other takeaway, my final point before passing it back to Tracy, would be, while this is, again, really important, we have to start a conversation about what else matters. What are the alternatives, so we do not find ourselves 10 years from now with PIAAC being the only measure, the so-called gold standard of whether or not we've been successful as practitioners and as policy developers.
Okay, thank you very much, Brigid. I think we should move on to the questions. So if you look at slide 65 invites your questions, slide 66 has our contact information. And if you're wondering about why we go to 73, we included a few other PIAAC-related slides in case we needed them during the questions. So, Lisa, are we going to take questions through the chat column? I'm thinking that's what we're doing. Yes. So if anybody has a question or a comment, we would love to hear it. Let's, I'll wait a minute. I'm going to figure out if Brigid and I can be on at the same time. We maybe can't. So for that reason, if you want to take the question, Brigid, you need to let me know. Oh, good. You're on. Okay. I'm going to do the teacher thing and be very silent for a minute to see if we have any questions or comments. And if we don't, then I guess we're done. So any questions out there, comments? Well, Donna Arnold said that was really good. Thanks. Maybe she... Good food for thought. This is a banquet for thought, believe me. I guess we should chat. The dead air is really hard.
Love the bigger picture.
Well, you know, Wendy says, I wish we could get the government to see it from the ground. I strongly believe in taking people into your programs and out to workplaces to kind of hug a learner and see what it's like. Finally, we have a question. How do we take the findings of PIAAC and design foundational programs in the field? Any suggestions? One of the things Brigid said, actually, that I hadn't mentioned myself, but one of the things I was most excited about PIAAC was the recognition that there are people below level 1, that kind of 0 to 1, and I think that is one where there has been a lot of traditional literacy, community literacy work, family literacy work, but you know, we didn't ever have a place to even talk about it under the old system. I think here there is one. I think if you're going to look at designing, if that is your goal, I always design programs around people, but if you want to kind of, as we say in British Columbia, crosswalk them to these findings, then you might want to look at the changing definitions. So I'm personally not going to give up document literacy because it's really helpful for me to talk about it and to think about it that way. But have a look at problem solving and the way that they formulated problem solving. You might want to integrate some of that using technology and problem solving into your program for sure. In fact, I am challenging myself to do that. Brigid, do you want to talk about what below level 1 looks like, and can we describe it by skills, or do you want me to do that?
Why don't you do that?
Okay, so one of the things that was fantastic about the below level 1 assessment is it actually started right at letter recognition. In all these different languages of the world. So if you have a look at it, it's amazing. And if you're a reading nerd like me, super, super fun to see. You know, they start with, do you know this letter? Can you know the name of this letter? So I don't know if they do you know the sound of this letter? And then very short words, and then phrases, and then sentences. So you could get assessed, for example, in the reading literacy component at really a level that IELTS 1 never ever looked at. And I think you would describe it in that way, certainly by reading. So it might be single word recognition, letter sound recognition, and then phrase recognition way before you get to sentences and paragraphs. And every one of the other skills has a similar, like for example, level 0 computer probably is refuse the computer, or something like that.
Yeah, that's right.
Do you think that Canada will adjust the 9 essential skills now? I keep telling people that they, you know, hey, who cares if they do? It happened. You know, problem solving in a technology-rich environment is here. It's in the air. Whether the Canadian government will do it, I don't know. But Brigid, I would love it if you would answer that.
I would love it if they would take a look at that. I think that there's, again, what happened to the IELTS levels is almost the same as what happened to the essential skills. I mean, those 9 essential skills were the ones that back in 1991 were the ones that were determined could be measured. I mean, there was never any understanding at the time, and I sat at the table, that these were going to be the 9 for all time. They were 9 that could be measured, they could be seen, and they appeared to be helpful. They also were an attempt to counterbalance some attitudinal skills where employers said they wanted something, but people couldn't quite put their finger on how would you know it if you had it, sort of thing. I think that over time the essential skills methodology has grown, and I think it could grow even more. I think that it's a helpful methodology for what it was designed to do, which was to assess the the competencies required to do jobs. Remember, though, that it was about tasks and jobs, not individuals. So I may score individually. Brigid may have a level 3 reading. However, if the job I am required to do requires level 2, essential skill, and that's what the essential skill requirement is. And I think what we've done over the years is we've mixed the two up. We've somehow said the essential skills, which is about occupations and tasks within occupations, got put onto the people and not understanding the two. So I'm all for re-examining and continuing to make these essential skills live and that methodology live. I fear, however, that we have not in the department that's employment, whatever they're called today, Employment and Social Development Canada, about the role of the essential skills profiles in terms of national occupational standards and national occupational classifications. There are not very many people even assigned to looking at this. I don't know what the budget is today. Do I think they need to be refreshed? Yes. Do they need to be refreshed in terms of PIAAC? Not across the board, but I think that they could be, certainly the technology kinds of things would be important to take a look at as well. So I think that's my convoluted.
So Tracy Mullins has asked about whether PIAAC could enhance arguments for continuing work with the very lower level students. And she says, but I worry we will find this challenging. Any recommendations? Well, as Brigid just said, there's a very good chance that nobody in the Ontario government has had a good look at the PIAAC data. And indeed, the cutbacks in the civil service has meant there aren't many people in the federal government. But I think a advocacy group could certainly show the recognition that there is a level 0 and a 1 that leads to 2, even if you're working in that framework. This says there's a place for that and a route even to the workforce through that continuum. Always remembering, though, that the second part of that picture is the one that Brigid so beautifully described, which is that since we know there's a general tendency to losing skills over time, the best economic strategy is to send young people into the workforce with such high skills that even as they regress to the norm, the mean, or as they lose skills over time perhaps, or they don't continue to learn at the same rate they did earlier, they will still end up, when they plane out, they will end up higher than the previous generation. It's like a beautiful educational metaphor for improvement. So I think that you could take this PIAAC picture of the world, and even if you don't get a good chance to talk about social outcomes, social cohesion, social capital, I think there's a place to say we are missing the opportunity to use our funding at this level and find some really hard numbers in PIAAC and maybe some really baffling graphs that would make that clear. that's, I think Tracy's right that there's a good, I love to say I think Tracy's right, by the way, but I think that there's a really great position here that definitely PIAAC widens the field in several ways. It moves the goalposts a little bit by taking out the great big hurdle in the middle.
And I think too that it's important to do here is to talk about a diversification of opportunities and different ways that we get to different places. I think one of the problems with IELTS and some of this was that all of a sudden the only thing that counted was getting to level 3 or getting to a work-related outcome. I think this goes back to the design question in my mind as well, is that we have reasons as adults to undertake learning for different purposes, and those purposes are all equally valid, and that we need to have sort of a suite of opportunities that ensures that whatever those purposes are, that they can be equally achieved. So whether I'm at, somebody who's at below level 1, that is as valid a purpose as taking a working person and moving them from level 2 to 3. We don't crosswalk very well, and we have a tendency to talk in generalities and not recognizing that, when I'm pursuing something for an academic purpose, like I want my grade 12, that's maybe different teaching mechanisms. It's different ways of assessing. It's different ways of reaching me. It's different ways of delivery if I am, having a job-related purpose. So sometimes we talk in code and we make it sound as if everybody should be sort of treated the same. So anyways, I think that this is a great opportunity because I think that people who are below level 1 have been subjugated to the church basements, and we leave them with the least trained volunteer support. Those people do a great job. They do the best they can, but we are not really investing in those people. So hopefully, I'm sorry, I shouldn't say those people. We are not investing in that group, and hopefully this will give some argumentation that will turn that around.
Brigid, what you said there just reminded me that one of the things I like about the PIAAC data is how much of an us it is. This is our entire country came out sort of in the middle. So maybe there is an opportunity here to really address a kind of us and them mentality about low-skilled people, or people who have measurements on low skills in some areas or something like that, because PIAAC says, everybody is in, this is our score for our whole country, and we're kind of middling. I really like that.
Yeah, and I think too we need to use this. Sometimes we need to use PIAAC as sort of what I would call behind the curtain information, like at the Wizard of Oz. Lots of times people don't need to know this information. You need to know it. Maybe the policymakers need to know it. But when I think of employers, they're not coming to people like Tracy and saying, oh geez, could you please make sure my workforce is measured at PIAAC level whatever for problem solving in technology-rich environments. That's not what they're saying. They're looking at some very practical outcomes which will count for them. And I think we need to be able to use the data and then reformulate it in a way that makes sense to whichever audience we're speaking to. So if I'm talking federally to the federal politician, maybe I'll talk PIAAC. But if I'm designing programs, that's all behind the curtain stuff. Trace, do we have any?
Great, Brigid. I like that. So I see that in the chat field we've had some discussion that kind of landed on the need for various ways to show and measure learning. I think that would be an excellent future webinar. And I think this might be a good time for us to stop. So you'll see we have a thank you slide with our contact information on slide 66. And I wonder if Lisa might like to say something to end us off as our host.